Hello everybody and welcome to the video. So today we are talking a little bit more in depth about our introduction to the cardiovascular system. I know that yesterday I had you watch some videos on this, so a lot of this information maybe you heard yesterday, but I did want to give it to you in this way just so you had it more concretely and you can go through it at your own speed and really make sure we're feeling good about the cardiovascular system. All right, so to start off, the main function of the cardiovascular system, it's really to circulate blood throughout your body. That's its main function. And we've talked about blood before. We've talked about it in when we talked about the immune system, and we also kind of just talked about blood on its own. But blood helps to do a couple different important things for the cardiovascular system. First, it helps to deliver nutrients and oxygen to your cells. So one of the main reasons why our body needs a system of sending things around is that our individual cells of our body need certain things to survive and to go through our basic metabolic processes. So that's going to mainly be thinking about cell respiration, for example. But in order to do cell respiration, cells need oxygen and cells need nutrients such as glucose in order to run that process. And blood is going to be the delivery system for those nutrients and oxygen that our cells need to complete those processes to stay alive. The other part of this is that when we do a process like cell respiration or we do something like metabolic growth, there are going to be waste products that get created. The other half of it is once those nutrients get dropped off, the blood is also going to be able to pick up waste and specifically carbon dioxide gas and take those away from cells. Carbon dioxide is going to be an output of cell respiration, and it's going to be something that if we keep it in our body, it can actually be poisonous. So we need to find a way to get rid of it, and the blood helps us to do that. Another function is that the blood helps us to maintain homeostasis, and this is mainly thinking about two ways of maintaining our body temperature and also making sure that our cells stay hydrated in order so that they can maintain their size and their shape. So it's helping our body overall to maintain its temperature and for our cells to stay healthy. And then lastly, as we talked about, our blood is going to carry our immune cells, namely our white blood cells, our platelets, all those good things. And they're going to help those to circulate around the body, get to where they need to be in order to make sure we stay safe. When thinking about the main parts of the cardiovascular system, there's going to be three main things we're going to think about. First is going to be the heart. That's probably the thing you think of first. The heart is going to be the first main part. The second part is the blood, because that's the thing that's moving throughout the system. And then lastly, we have blood vessels. And these are, as we can see in the picture, we have kind of these tubes that run through our body. And these are going to be the channels that our blood takes in order to access the different parts of our body. And we're going to break down those blood vessels right now. So when we think about blood vessels, there are a few different types that we find inside of our body. So the main reason why we have them is that blood vessels carry blood to all body parts and allow for exchange of materials between the blood and the body. And there are three main types of vessels that we find. First are going to be arteries. And the main idea of arteries is that they carry blood away from the heart. So a way to think about this is that arteries carry away. I think that they both start with A. Arteries go away. So arteries carry blood away from the body. And this is usually oxygenated blood, and hopefully that makes sense. We mentioned that the main function, one of the main parts of blood is that they carry oxygen to cells in the body that need them. So if the blood is going away from the heart, that means that it's going towards body cells that need that oxygen. The only exception to this rule is actually the pulmonary artery, and we'll talk more about the pulmonary artery in just a bit. The largest artery we're going to find in our body is the aorta, and again, we'll break that down in a little bit more detail as well. As a general convention, whenever we think about the cardiovascular system, the circulatory system, in artistic representations, we will often represent arteries as being red. So whenever you see red, that usually means arteries. So we can see that here. Here's blood coming out. Whenever there's that red, that means that it is an artery there. Another main type of blood vessel that we have are called our veins, and veins do the opposite of arteries. They carry blood towards the heart. So arteries go away while veins help to carry blood back towards the heart. And because of that, they usually carry deoxygenated blood, so blood that does not have oxygen in it. And hopefully this makes sense as well. Once the blood gets carried away to the parts of the body by the arteries, the cells are going to pick up that oxygen. And then as that blood is coming back to the heart, it's not going to have oxygen anymore. There is one exception to this, and this is in the pulmonary vein. And again, we'll talk about this more in just a second. And the largest vein in the body we're going to find is the vena cava, which actually kind of has two parts shown here and here. The last main type of blood vessels are called capillaries. And for capillaries, we got to get much, much smaller. So capillaries are the smallest vessel where a vein changes into an artery. Where we're going to find capillaries is kind of right in this area. It's shown in this picture where it kind of transitions from red to blue. This is where we're going to find our capillaries. And you can see them labeled here, where they're called the capillaries of the upper body, systemic capillaries here. And these are the systemic capillaries of the lower body. So this is where this should say artery changes into a vein. So this is where an artery changes into a vein. So the blood's coming through here. Once the oxygen gets picked up, once the exchange happens, then it turns into a vein. So it's an artery turning into a vein. That happens in the capillaries. And capillaries, part of the main reason why they're really special is that they're thin enough to allow for exchange of gas/nutrient/waste between the blood and the body. So they're basically thin enough to basically allow these things that need to transfer between the blood and the body to just pass right through the thin walls of the capillaries. So they just allow things to come in and out through diffusion. And that's how parts of our body are able to get what they need through our capillaries. So again, this should say is where a artery changes to a vein. Artery changes to a vein. Sorry about that typo there. All right, next we are going to talk about the chambers of the heart. There are a couple different chambers and they have different functions within our heart. So the first type of chamber we find is called an atrium. And this is what we think of as being the upper receiving chamber. And their main function is to push blood into the ventricles, which is going to be the other chamber we'll talk about in a sec. Pointing out the atrium or atria in our picture here, we find the right atrium here, and we find the left atrium here. The plural of atrium is atria, so you'll often hear those two kind of used interchangeably. And to keep track of where we find the atrium, think A for above. So atrium starts with A, think A for above. The atrium are going to be the two upper chambers of the heart. And again, their main function, as I mentioned, is that they push blood into the ventricles, which is the second type of chamber we find in the heart. So the ventricles are going to be the lower pumping chamber. And these are responsible for pushing blood out of the heart to the lungs or the rest of the body. So depending on which ventricle we're in, it's going to change where they're pumping blood to. And we'll talk about how that changes. So what we see here is we have over here on the right, we have the right ventricle, and then we have the left ventricle on the other side. As I've been mentioning, there are two of each of these, one on the left, one on the right. So we have two atriums and two atria and two ventricles. So we have our right atria, right ventricle, left atria, left ventricle. And when we're thinking about how these are named, they are dependent on standard anatomical position. So if you are trying to keep track of which one is the left atria and which one's the right atria, for example, I think it's easiest to consider it's from your perspective. And if you were to look down at your heart, use that right and left to kind of figure out which one's on the right, which one's on the left. So from your perspective, looking straight down onto your heart, the one that's towards the right is your right side, the right atria and right ventricle, and the half on the left is the left atria and the left ventricle. All right, so now we're going to talk about blood flow circuits and thinking about how blood gets pushed through the cardiovascular system. So there are two distinct circuits that blood flows through, I should say flows through our body, or follows through our body. One of them is going to be called the pulmonary circuit. And this is where it's going to pump blood to and from the lungs to pick up oxygen and drop off carbon dioxide. So the pulmonary circuit is going to be kind of depicted in this blue part of the heart here. So it's going to involve the right atrium and the right ventricle. And as you can see, if you follow the arrow here, as we are leaving the right ventricle here, it is coming out to the sides here. And this is where lungs are going to be in our body. So it's not showing our lungs directly, but this is where we find our lungs in our body. It's kind of on either side of the heart. So the pulmonary circuit, its job is to pump blood into the lungs. And in the lungs, what's basically going to happen with our blood is that the blood is going to drop off the carbon dioxide that it picked up from the body, and then is going to pick up oxygen so that that blood is now oxygenated. And then to finish the pulmonary circuit, the blood will come back into the heart on the left side. The other circuit that we have is called the systemic circuit, and this pumps blood to and from the rest of the body. So again, we're coming in here. We just came from the pulmonary circuit, and we are now entering the systemic circuit. So we come in through the left atrium. We then go into the left ventricle, and then blood is going to get pumped out through this. This represents our aorta here, and this is going through the rest of the body. So we have kind of one part that goes down and one part that goes up, so that we can get both halves of our body, and that's our systemic circuit. We go through here, and then we come back, and then we end up in the right side of the heart, so that we can then do the pulmonary circuit. So when we were thinking about how blood flows, you go through the pulmonary circuit, then the systemic circuit, then back to pulmonary, back to systemic. It just keeps going and going and going. So this ensures that when blood is flowing, it is able to get oxygen from the pulmonary circuit, and then it gets pumped out to the body to drop off that oxygen, comes back to the heart, gets more oxygen, gets pumped out to drop off that oxygen, on and on and on. And that's the main circuitry of our blood flow. And I kind of just talked through this a little bit, but to exactly spell out the ventricles and the atria that it's passing through, and some more specific names of important arteries and veins, I wanted to go through the steps of blood flow. So we'll start here in the right ventricle. So the right ventricle pumps blood through, we're going to call this kind of major blue tube the pulmonary trunk, and it's going to go towards the lungs. So this is our pulmonary trunk. It's labeled here, pulmonary trunk. Next, the blood enters the left atrium through the pulmonary veins. So we can see here this red kind of tube coming into the left atrium. We call this the pulmonary vein. Again, this is the only vein in the body that has oxygenated blood in it. So it enters the left atrium. We then go into the left ventricle, and the left ventricle pumps blood through the aorta, which is this tube here. This is going to be our aorta, and it's going to pump blood through the rest of the body. So whether we go to the bottom half or the top half, pumps blood through. And then the last step, blood from the body enters the right atrium here through the superior and inferior vena cava. And we have two kind of names for our vena cava here because it's coming from two directions. We call this upper one the superior vena cava, and this lower one the inferior vena cava. And hopefully that makes sense. We are using our directional terms here. Remember that superior means towards the head, and inferior means away from the head. So this inferior vena cava comes up from the lower body, and the superior vena cava comes down from the upper body. And then this process repeats. We go back up to this first step. So this just spells out how blood flows through our cardiovascular system. And then for our last slide, we're talking about some separating structures. So how our heart more particularly gets separated. The first thing we want to point out is a septum. So a septum is any wall that divides the chamber of the heart. So we can see a couple different examples of the septum in our heart here. The main one is going to be this septum right here, which is going to divide the left half and the right half of the heart. There can be some major issues here if there is damage done to this main part of the septum here, because there can be mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood between the right and left ventricles, and that can cause some major medical issues. So any damage to the septum really in any part of the heart can definitely lead to some serious issues. But this we would also consider a septum. This is also septum. Anywhere you kind of see this wall here, we consider a septum. However, you should hopefully be able to also see that there are some openings that appear in the septum, and those are going to be locations of valves. And valves are going to be openings between the major chambers and the arteries/veins of the heart that can open and close. So these are basically necessary to allow the pumping action of the heart to occur. And we're going to talk about these individual valves. The reason why valves are really important is that they ensure what is called unidirectional blood flow, which means that it only allows blood to flow in one direction. As we can see in these arrows here, this is going to be the natural direction that blood flows in. It would be really bad if blood, for example, were able to come back and flow the opposite way. That would not allow for blood pressure to exist. And it would not allow blood to be effectively circulated throughout our body. So that's why you often hear blood pressure talked about a lot. We'll talk about blood pressure in a different video, but blood pressure is really important, and it is maintained by these valves here. And we'll talk more about how these valves can open and close in just a second. To go through the four main valves of the heart, the first one we're going to have is called the tricuspid valve. And the tricuspid valve separates the right atrium and the right ventricle. So we're going to find it right here. So this is the tricuspid valve. This is the right atria. This is the right ventricle. And the tricuspid valve separates these two chambers. The next valve we have is the pulmonary semilunar valve. And this separates the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. So we're going to find that right here. So this is kind of the top part of the right ventricle, and then once we get past that valve is when we get to the pulmonary trunk, and this valve separates the two. So once it gets pumped by the right ventricle, it won't come back through the pulmonary trunk. It basically gets forced to get pushed into the lungs. Our next valve is the mitral valve, and this separates the left atrium and the left ventricle. We're going to find that right here. This is the mitral valve. So this is our left atrium, left ventricle. And then our final valve is the aortic semilunar valve, and this separates the left ventricle and the aorta. And we find the aortic semilunar valve right here. We have our left ventricle and we have our aorta up here. So this separates those two areas. All right, so I know I went through those a little quickly, but what I do want to show you is I do have kind of this heart pumping in motion to show us the importance of these valves and how they work. So we're following our blood flow here. So we know that blood is received into the heart through our atria, through our right atria and our left atria. So the atria is going to push the blood into our ventricles, whether it's the left or right ventricle. And once that blood gets pumped in, that the valve is then going to close after that blood enters. And then once there's pressure in our ventricles here, when the ventricles are pushing blood away from the heart, the other valve here is going to open. So it pushes the blood through. Blood is allowed to flow out through the pulmonary trunk or through the aorta here. And because of the design of our tricuspid valve and our mitral valve here, blood, when the ventricles contract, blood is not going to be allowed back into our atrium here, because if you can see the way that they're built, if we were to put pressure onto the valve, kind of upwards pressured here, blood would not be allowed through because, again, they are unidirectional. They only allow for one-way blood flow. So blood is kind of forced out of this valve, and then once it comes through, it may be kind of tempted to come back through once the ventricles release, but the pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve, again, are set up the same way as these other two valves to not allow the blood to come back through either the pulmonary trunk or the aorta. So this unidirectional blood flow, again, is maintained by these valves, and it allows for proper circulation of blood throughout our body. Alrighty, that's going to wrap up what I have. Thank you all for watching.